So my concept is what I'm calling policy praxis. It's a public-private policy innovation lab. And what we do is we design, build, and facilitate feedback models between governments and the public. In order to develop better policy outcomes for all. So how do we do this? Start with our values. So the first is to empathize, because people are more than just numbers. People over party, because people come in all shapes and sizes, but not red or blue. Nothing about a single finger explains the hand, so develop synergies. I love that concept from Buckminster Fuller. And there's no hiding behind glass, but there's no mistaking who you are. So be open and transparent. And our greatest competition should be ourselves. So strive for excellence. And the way I position these values was a value should be for engaging with the public, a value for engaging with governments, a value for engaging with our teammates, a value for engaging with potential partners like private entities, and then also a value for engaging with ourselves. So I think it's important to start off the why with how policy is evaluated. So when we think about policy, there are three major frames which to view it, right? It's the economic, social, and environmental impacts of policy made. So if we were to take a case study, like let's say a local government decides to use, or charge people that make more than $100,000 a year for public education, right, to offset the cost for people that make less. We can see how there's a major economic advantage to something like that. Where is that coming from? Sorry about the noise, guys. However, there's also a social disadvantage and potentially an environmental disadvantage to a policy like that. Whereas something like creating community gardens in urban food deserts, it creates a win across all of these different frameworks. And so the reason I offer this first is because I think that the economic is sort of where we live in today's policy culture, and making sure that, the money is there, and, probably never that. But the social and environmental are critical, right, to reinventing this policy process, and the social is where policy praxis lives. So essentially, the policy process today starts with some sort of a disruption, whether it's environmental, political, social, whatever you might have. But it essentially sets the policymakers off into more or less a problem identification stage. And at this stage, they're really trying to understand what exactly needs to happen, and also where they need to go get information and from who, which then kicks off the next stage, which is information gathering. So the policymakers then go out and, sometimes do surveys or, talk to experts. It's very popular right now to create working groups for policy decisions as well, where people from the community can essentially apply to be part of a working group that's sort of involved with the decision-making process. Then the development stage, this is where, more experts get involved and the policymakers really make decisions about what's going to happen. And then ultimately implementation until the next disruption. So if you'll see, I also added something that I'm calling a public engagement score. And I'm going to get more into the weeds on that in a little bit. But if we think about the research specifically with the context of governments and their decision about how to deliver education in the pandemic, which was, my focus in terms of case study, at the identification stage, there was a little bit of conversation done specifically with people like the heads of the PTA and, the union leadership for teachers to identify what exactly was the problem. And, you could go as far to say it's like information from Fauci or, other epidemiologists would play into this as well. And then the information gathering stage, I think most school districts, based on the research that I did use some form of town halls, surveys, and also, like I said, those working groups. And so, they got about a 4 out of 10, but the qualitative research really wasn't there, which we'll get to again in just a couple minutes. And then development implementation, there was hardly anything at all. And we heard from parents, teachers, community members, that they were really craving more information throughout the process, and also ways to engage and give feedback beyond just the sort of like figurehead of whatever social group they belong to. So if we see that process again a little bit smaller, and then we consider the public being engaged at each of these stages in some sort of a feedback loop, that's where policy praxis lives, is at the center of those feedback loops. So to walk through a sort of like storyboard without images, unfortunately, let's say the Boston Board of Education needs to determine the summer school plan. The pandemic's still raging, none of the vaccines worked. So a public engagement audit would be carried out by policy praxis on spec, but then would submit a subsequent proposal. In that proposal, policy praxis would make recommendations for engagement mechanisms to run with potential score increases. So that the public engagement score becomes a metric for policy praxis to demonstrate the effectivity or the efficacy of the work that they're doing with these feedback loops. So the Board of Education reviews proposal and opts to engage in hybrid forms and public betas as two of the recommendations. Policy praxis reviews the plan of action with relevant orgs and expert stakeholders to make sure that people like, the head of the the teachers union are not excluded, the PTA, as an organization is not excluded, and also people within the school district itself on how this stuff is going to get carried out and facilitated on the ground. So then policy praxis runs the feedback mechanisms at each stage. And at each stage, 2 reports are generated. The first is for internal use to make itself better, and then the others for external use. And going back to that sort of like public engagement score and how we saw the outcome change as opposed to prior policy decisions. So ultimately, the Board of Education makes their final decisions and requests policy praxis to assist with embedding public betas in their organization. So I'm going to walk through the full model in just a second, but essentially policy praxis would then be asked to fit it within the organization so that policy praxis doesn't have to be the facilitator moving forward. And then finally, policy praxis improves upon designs with the new information from the test. So creating this sort of feedback loop. The core of the work happens, I believe, from humanists and social scientists and designers who are heavily focused on participatory democracy as their interest area. And what they do is they create these theoretical models for how to create those feedback loops. And then those feedback loops go from theory to test to practice, and then go back to feeding theory. So we have this nice virtuous circle happening within policy praxis and outside policy praxis as far as participatory democracy goes. So the public engagement mechanism, this still definitely needs some work, but essentially if we take the policy making process, and then I've outlined 5 key sort of like areas that need their own defining metrics within each of them. But it's what are the mechanisms being used? How is the information being captured? What is being done to analyze the information? How is the information being shared and with who? And then also directionality. So one of the things from the research was that the information was flowing very much in one way and not the other way. And so that directionality is almost like a binary question. Is it flowing back and forth, or is it just flowing one way? And all of these would essentially impact or lead to a public engagement score for departments or cities and how they're working. So what it's going to take to get there, I definitely want to build this out more, but that finalizing and validating of the public engagement measuring model and its value to organizations, both outside of government and in government, is going to be, I think, the prototype or the ultimate MVP that needs the most work. But then finding a city willing to pilot that, specifically with respect to mechanisms that could potentially improve that public engagement score. And then lastly, securing funding for cost of first engagement. So I put all this here as like what I'm hoping to achieve for next semester, but that's a pretty tall order, so we'll see. Um, and then beyond that, so policy praxis again starts with gathering and sharing information for these first few years, but it's really a Trojan horse to get us to start doing design work in decision making methods, and which is its own black box as far as behind closed doors, politicians weighing decisions, looking at the data, and producing a final policy decision. And then finally, over time, the trust gets built up between policy praxis and its partner cities, to ultimately offer internal structural proposals, which is the big pie in the sky, democracy changing things like qualitative feedback on ballots. That's what I got.